Senator Cotton, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you, Kristen, for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's start with this devastating news, the discovery of 6 bodies, hostages, including Israeli-American Hersh Goldberg Polin. Everyone, I think, feels heartbroken this morning, the entire nation and, frankly, world mourning these deaths. What is your reaction, Senator, and what do you think this will mean for hostage negotiations?
Well, it's terribly sad news that Hamas executed these 6 hostages in cold blood, apparently shot them in the head shortly before they might have been rescued by Israeli Defense Forces. My heart goes out to all the families, especially Hersh Goldberg Polin's family, our fellow American. There are other fellow Americans still to be accounted for. But I think we should note that these hostages were discovered in the tunnels under Rafah. That's where Joe Biden and Kamala Harris put pressure on Israel not to enter for months, using an arms embargo to try to keep them from entering. Kamala Harris even said that Israel shouldn't enter Rafah because she had studied the maps. What the Biden-Harris administration should have done from the beginning is not pressure Israel to restrain.
I laugh because it's sad and because people are on the precipice of electing somebody who is that unintelligent, the same person who was the last one in the room with Joe Biden before the debacle took place during the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Its response, but let Israel win from the very outset. For 11 months, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have put more pressure on Israel than they put on Hamas and Iran's other terror proxies.
And Senator, just to be clear, there, of course, is no arms embargo. It is true that the Biden administration did halt one shipment of arms out of concern over civilian casualties.
No, Kristen, that's not correct.
It is correct. There's no arms embargo.
For weeks, the Biden-Harris administration put an embargo, not just on large 2,000-pound bombs, which of course are needed to penetrate these deep and buried tunnels, but on things like tank rounds and artillery shells and mortar rounds.
It was just one shipment of arms. It was the 2,000-pound
Kristen,
weapons
it was a
that you're
large
talking about
category
and
of weapons.
500 pounds. But
it was a large category of weapons.
Okay, but they have now moved forward with that. It's not an arms embargo, though, just to be very clear. That's a very specific term, and it's not an arms embargo.
It was in place for many weeks, specifically to try to prevent Israel from entering Rafah, where these hostages were discovered. Yeah. If we had simply backed Israel to the hilt from October 7th, this war would probably be over. We probably would have found many more hostages alive, and there would have been fewer civilian casualties caused by Hamas's infliction of those civilian casualties on its.
Tom Cotton is 100% correct. You go in hard, and you use absolutely overwhelming force if you have the ability to, and that shortens the duration of any conflict and war. If it's 50-50 and you're slugging it out in the ring rather than Mike Tyson coming up and knocking you out with an uppercut in the first round, that's what you want for the civilians. And you notice how combative and how defensive the host is for the Biden and Harris administration.
Own people. But at every turn, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have put more pressure on Israel than they have on Iran and Hamas.
And of course, they have also argued that the U.S. stands firmly behind Israel. It was one arms shipment. Let's talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu.
You know how she keeps repeating the same talking point when Tom has attempted to correct her. And then she says, let's move on, because she wants it indelibly left in the audience's mind that her propaganda is what is truthful when it's not. Hopefully, I think that Tom's about to come and correct her again.
It was many more. No, Kristen, you can do your fact check thing all you want. I'm going to tell you the real facts. It was a large category of weapons, far beyond just 2,000-pound bombs.
Okay, but it wasn't an arms embargo. That's my only point. It wasn't specifically an arms embargo. Let's just move forward, in terms of what Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing right now, because he's been facing pressure in the wake of this. He's been resistant to accepting this hostage deal. Axios' Barak Ravid reports that a senior Israeli official said, quote, "We warned Netanyahu and the cabinet ministers about this exact scenario, but they wouldn't listen." Do you believe Prime Minister Netanyahu bears any responsibility for not getting a deal sooner?
No, I believe Hamas bears responsibility for not turning these hostages back over to their families and surrendering. At every turn, Benjamin Netanyahu has tried to meet the Biden administration halfway. They continue to move the goalposts. They continue to encourage and embolden Hamas. Consider what happened just a few weeks ago when the prime minister was here to speak at the Capitol. Kamala Harris didn't even sit behind him in a joint session of her Congress, one of her few duties as vice president. Then she came out after a private meeting with him and stressed that we need a ceasefire now, which is the de facto Hamas position. What did you have 2 days later? You had Israeli children being blown up on playgrounds because every time Joe Biden and Kamala Harris put more pressure on Israel, it simply emboldens Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran.
Just to be very clear, though, there is pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. You have people protesting in the streets. He is, of course, the leader of Israel, and that's who I'm asking you about. Do you think, and would you urge him in this moment, Senator, to get a deal given these casualties?
I would urge him.
It is not our prerogative to dictate how another independent country must deal with a threat that lies at their doorstep, a group that is actually wanting to commit a genocide against them. From the river to the sea, that's a genocidal term.
To finish the job against Hamas, which is exactly what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden should have done from the very beginning. Again, if we had backed Israel to the hilt, if we hadn't continually put pressure on Israel to slow and to moderate its response, Hamas would have been broken and we would have gotten more of these hostages down alive. The only time Hamas has even come close to releasing hostages is when they are on the ropes.
And of course, the U.S. has given more aid, both military and monetary, to Israel than any other country. But let's
well, to be exact, we've given hundreds of billions of dollars in relief to Iran.
Well, some of that money, of course, is frozen. But let's move on to some.
Frozen. Let's move on. Some of that money is frozen. How much of it is frozen? You unfroze billions of dollars when Iran was on its heels, and now they are funding terror activities with it. This is clearly the fault of the Biden administration. But then she says some of that money is still frozen. How much, Kristen? Is it $1? Is it $25? Is it $25 billion? Because I know that they had billions freed up in order to fund terror when that regime was on the verge of falling without a war.
Domestic news, if we could. The issue of abortion front and center this week. Donald Trump has gone from calling himself throughout the arc of time very pro-choice at one point. He's more recently bragged about overturning Roe v. Wade. He now says he's going to vote to keep Florida's 6-week abortion ban in place, a law he once described as terrible. How can people trust Trump on this issue when he keeps shifting his position?
Well, the president's been very clear. He does not support a nationwide abortion law. In fact, there's only one candidate in this race who supports a nationwide abortion law. It's Kamala Harris. And we know what it is because the Senate proposed it and we voted on it. It is radical and extreme. It would require taxpayer funding of abortion up to the moment of birth. That's what she stands for. She's the only one in this race calling for a nationwide abortion law, something that is wildly unpopular.
Just to be clear, the bill you're talking to requires that there be exceptions for health through the end of pregnancy, not that all abortions be legal in all cases.
But President Trump has said he supports exceptions when a woman's health is at risk, when she's been raped or been the victim of incest. And the vast majority of Americans support those as well. But this law is radical. It would overturn 50 years of precedent and require taxpayer funding for abortion, even in these cases.
Well, taxpayer funding for abortion is currently, of course, illegal under the Hyde Amendment. And just to be clear, abortions later in pregnancy, 21 weeks and after, are extremely rare.
Well, if they're so rare,
in the case of a health emergency,
if they're so rare, why won't Kamala Harris say then fine, we shouldn't allow them with those exceptions?
Because of the concern for health emergencies.
But if you have those exceptions, Kristen, if you have those exceptions, it will account for those rare health emergencies. So why won't she say it?
But that is what the law does. It says up to the time of viability with exceptions. States are allowed to have exceptions if there are health emergencies.
Kamala Harris voted.
We're just going to go ahead and move on, she's about to say. I guarantee it, because that's what they always do. They simp for the Democrats. They leave that last thread in the minds of the viewer because it's first impression, final impression based on that topic. And that's what they want to leave the viewer with. Let's move on because I'm always going to get the last word. That's the way that the media works.
Kamala Harris voted against the Born Alive Victims Protection Act.
She did not.
Yes, she did.
Senator,
I was there.
She voted against.
I was there. She voted against it. Kristen, if these cases are so rare,
she voted
in
against
the late
advancing
term,
the bill twice.
If these cases are so rare in late-term pregnancy, then why won't she say, you know what, we should prohibit these with exceptions for the mother's life?
Yeah.
Why won't she say that? Because she is a radical on abortion.
Just to be clear, she voted against advancing the bill twice when she was senator. She's called it extreme. Let me ask you about something else. I interviewed J.D. Vance last week. He told me Donald Trump would veto a federal abortion ban if it came to his desk. Now Trump is not committing to that. Do you think he would sign that veto if it came to his desk?
Well, why is she asking this question? Trump has stated it. J.D. Vance has affirmed it. Trump has stated it multiple times on multiple podcasts. She's claiming and wants to leave in the viewer's mind that there's some wiggle room here based on rumors. That's what they're trying to do. They are trying to undermine the election prospects of Donald Trump, of the Republicans, because they're partisan hacks and they are reaching into the honeypot of taxpayer dollars. The bosses are, and these are their employees greasing the skids to enable them to back up the dump truck and take as much from there as possible.
It's a hypothetical, first off. We both know there's not going to be 60 votes in the Senate anytime soon for either party's preferred or centrist position on abortion, whether it's the radical position that Democrats have or the pro-life position that most Republicans have. So I think it's a hypothetical question. But President Trump has been consistent, is that there's not going to be a nationwide abortion law while he's president. He appointed 3 justices who reversed Roe v. Wade, which was wrongly decided, which even liberal scholars acknowledged was poorly reasoned, and returned this question to where it had rested for 170 years, which is the American people making choices through their elected representatives at their states. States are going to have different kinds of laws. Donald Trump has acknowledged that.
I hear you're saying that former President Trump has been consistent, but as we showed, he's actually pivoted quite a bit on this issue. But J.D. Vance was very clear. He said that Donald Trump would veto a nationwide ban. And I guess the question is, why can't Trump be clear with people about where he stands? Are you clear? I know you're saying it's a hypothetical.
Kristen, he has been clear
about what he would do?
He has been clear that there will not be a nationwide abortion law when he's president. He has been perfectly consistent on that. Now, Kamala Harris, to her credit, she's been consistent and not tried to hide her radical position on abortion. It's the only position she hasn't tried to hide over the last 6 weeks, like her position on decriminalizing illegal immigration or banning gas-powered cars or banning fracking. Abortion is the one issue on which she hasn't tried to hide her position from the American people in this election.
I'm going to talk to Congressman Ro Khanna about all of that coming up, but let's stick with Donald Trump. His big announcement on IVF this week. He said Thursday he wants the government to pay for or force insurance companies to cover IVF. Is that something you would support, Senator?
Well, all Republicans, to my knowledge, support IVF in the Congress, and there's no state that prohibits or regulates IVF in a way that makes it inaccessible. It is expensive for many couples. I understand that. So it's something I'm open to, that most Republicans would be open to. I think we'd have to evaluate the fiscal impact, whether the taxpayer can afford to pay for this, what impact it would have on premiums. But in principle, supporting couples who are trying to use IVF or other fertility treatments, I don't think is something that's controversial at all.
Well, 2 months ago, you voted against.
In fairness, that's not the position that I necessarily would take, although I do want people to be able to have babies. I don't think that we should be collectively paying for the decisions that other people make not to have them earlier in life or before they turn 45 or whenever the age that the mother can stop having them. But it's a decent answer by him. I'm just not sure I agree.
It's a Senate bill that would have protected and expand IVF access, and it would have mandated that some coverage was covered by health insurance plans. If that bill came back to the floor, would you now support it? Is that what you're saying?
You mean Chuck Schumer's ridiculous messaging bill?
So no.
That requires fertility treatment for men who think they're women?
But
that was slapped together in a summer when she slapped together a bunch of other bills.
It's a bill that also would have protected and expanded IVF
Chuck Schumer has been all summer. Chuck Schumer's been all summer long slapping together ridiculous bills that he thinks are going to help his liberal incumbent senators face off in their re-elections.
Just very quickly, do you know where this money would come from to cover IVF? Because in 2022, some $8 billion were paid by.
Well, no, again, that's why I say we'd have to evaluate any specific legislation.
So you wouldn't support taxpayer dollars.
I'd have to evaluate any specific legislation as I would on any legislation.
So you're still undecided on where you stand on this government-funded IVF plan.
Well, I certainly support couples having access to IVF, and it's not even a controversial issue in any of the 50 states.
All right, let me ask you about another one of the big headlines this week: Donald Trump's visit to Arlington National Cemetery. You've been talking about this. He attended a wreath-laying ceremony, obviously, for the 13 service members who were killed during the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. He was invited by those family members. Important to say that.
Thank you for saying that.
He also had campaign staffers with him. Photos, videos were posted on a campaign site. Taking campaign photos and videos at grave sites is forbidden under federal law. You, of course, served at Arlington Cemetery in the Old Guard, so I know that this is a sacred place for you. Bottom line, though, I guess, Senator, is it ever appropriate to make campaign content at military grave sites?
He didn't take campaign photos there. These families, Gold Star families, whose children died because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's incompetence, invited him to the cemetery, and they asked him to take those photos because, as they told me yesterday when I spoke to Kelly Barnett and Darren Hoover, the parents of Taylor Hoover, who has Arkansas ties, they don't get to go to the beach on Labor Day. They don't get to have barbecues. This is their one chance to have a memory of their children, to commemorate their service and to honor their sacrifice. They wanted President Trump there. They wanted to take those photos. You know who the families also invited? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Where were they? Joe Biden was sitting at a beach. Kamala Harris was sitting at her mansion in Washington, D.C. She was 4 miles away. 10 minutes. She could have gone to the cemetery and honored the sacrifice of those young men and women.
She could have, but she didn't, because it would put the onus on the fact that Kamala Harris bragged about being the last person in the room with Joe Biden before the debacle, which was the Afghanistan withdrawal, which in turn left these soldiers dead. And that would put a damper on her political prospects when people remember this, because most people have very short memories. Thank you, Tom Cotton, for bringing that up.
But she hasn't. She never has spoken to them or taken a meeting with them.
Well, they did meet with them during the dignified transfer. They were with them at the dignified transfer.
The dignified transfer, you mean the one where Joe Biden looked at his watch when he was addressing the families during that time? That was the, quote, dignified transfer?
Her and Joe Biden's incompetence, those 13 Americans were killed in Afghanistan.
Well, not everyone obviously was pleased with this visit. And again, just the law says memorial services and ceremonies at Army, national, military cemeteries will not include partisan political activities.
And it didn't, Chris. President Trump wasn't wearing a red...
It was posted on a campaign site, though.
He wasn't wearing a red MAGA hat.
I understand.
He didn't have a Trump
pants. It was posted on the
just
Trump
like Joe
TikTok
Biden, just like Joe Biden has posted content of himself in the cemetery or in other cemeteries or a dignified transfer.
Yeah.
They're all American citizens. They have a right to go there and to honor the sacrifice of those 13 Americans who Joe Biden and Kamala Harris sent to their death.
Let me ask you about what we're hearing from another family. The family of Master Sergeant Andrew Marchesano. He was a Green Beret. His family was concerned that his grave was actually shown in a photo that was posted on social media. A statement from the Marchesanos' sister, Michelle, said, quote, "We hope that those visiting this sacred site understand that these were real people who sacrificed our freedom and that they are honored and respected accordingly." Did the Trump campaign fail to honor her wishes, their wishes?
No, Kristen, they honored the wishes of the 13 families whose children died at Abbey Gate. Those families wanted the photos. They told me yesterday that they specifically asked President Trump for the photos. Obviously, headstones at Arlington are close to each other. And when you take a photo of your loved one, when you take a photo of your loved one, then other headstones are going to be present as well. Frankly, I think it's pretty disappointing that the New York Times went and found a family whose headstone was featured in that photograph of another Gold Star family, and then went to them to try to embarrass the Gold Star families who wanted President Trump.
Very quickly, have you had any conversations with former President Trump about joining his administration should he win?
All we're talking about is making sure that he does win and that we elect Republican majorities in the Congress so we can begin to reverse some of the damage that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have caused.
All right, Senator Tom Cotton, thank you so much for being here this morning on this Labor Day. Hope you get some time with family. Really appreciate it.
The reason that I keep making videos about interactions between the media and politicians is because it's very easy to diagnose which side they are on, as well as their tactics, which I hope I laid out a couple. It's always, let's move on as I get the final point, in which will leave the indelible mark in the viewer. Nevertheless, I think that Tom Cotton acquitted himself incredibly well here, and he parried the blows from Kristen Welker. One has to ask why J.D. Vance can do this, why Donald Trump can do this, why Tom Cotton can do this, and why Kamala Harris cannot do this, why she refuses to go onto the media, and certainly not a friendly media. And do you think that Kamala Harris would have gotten the same treatment as Tom Cotton, as J.D. Vance have, which is much more combative? I don't believe that's the case, because they are after, as I stated, the honeypot, which is the taxpayer dollars and all of that printed money that is going into the coffers of these corporations as they get the government contracts, as they produce very little in exchange. It's essentially rent-seeking behavior that they're engaging in, and these are the soldiers at the front line that ensure that the right people get in, that will allow them to continue to dip their hand into the cookie jar. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Very curious. Peace.